Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series along with Dr. Terry Davidson, Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior at American University and a distinguished professor of neuroscience here. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening.
Today, our guest on the Lobes and Robe podcast is Dr. Jay Schulkin. Just a little background about Jay. After he earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Purchase College, Jay received his PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. He's currently a research professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Georgetown University Medical Center and in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Gynecology at the University of Washington. He was previously also the Senior Director of Research at the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and a Research Associate at the National Institutes of Mental Health. Jay is author of 361 total publications, including 24 books. His work encompasses and typically integrates perspectives from philosophy, particularly pragmatism, psychology, evolution, medicine and health, and neuroscience, which underlies much of his work. I'd like to read a couple comments from reviews of several of his books. And these reviews come from some of the most recognizable people in the field of neuroscience and psychology. This one, Schulkin is a keen observer, a neuroscience philosopher, and an astute commentator on human nature. This was from Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University. Another comment was, Jay Schulkin has a wonderful gift, the ability to extract the seminal messages in a large corpus of work relating biological processes, psychological outcomes, and ranging these kernels of facts into a coherent narrative with a direction and a unifying theme. That was from Jerome Kagan at Harvard University. The focus today, although our conversation it'll be probably a little more wide-ranging, is on not his most recent book, but a recent book called Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Pragmatism and Neuroscience. This book explores culture, philosophy, and the law as they interact with neuroscience, biology, and through the perspective of the American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes. Our podcast, Lobes and Robes, this is exactly what we're interested in, the integration of law and neuroscience. And so we're extremely pleased to have Dr. Schulkin with us today to discuss his ideas on these topics. Thank you for joining us today, Jay.
It's good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much. And you are kicking off our second season. So thanks for agreeing to be on.
Great. Glad to be here.
So I am really interested in all of the topics that you are talking about, pragmatism, social neuroscience, and the sort of integration or consilience between different disciplines in legal theory and science, and especially neuroscience and history. That's what this book that we're going to sort of start with as we talk to you, that's what it's about. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what led you to write this book and what your goals for the book are.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I wrote this book because pragmatism has been a long-term interest. Neuroscience is a long-term interest. I was always trying to find ways to link them together and thought that the law would be a place to do it. And so I'm out in California. We live in San Rafael. Several colleagues said at Stanford University Law School, there's a center there for neuroscience and the law. Went out there to visit Hank Greeley, got on very well, talked a lot about neuroscience and the law, read a lot about neuroscience and the law through Hank's work and his colleagues, engaged the field, but he could sense that my larger interest for coming out to that law school was my interest in Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Why Holmes Jr.? Because he was very much part of the group that came to be known as the early pragmatists. He was a primary participant in what was the Metaphysical Club, which discussed many issues about naturalism, the law, and emerging fields in science. In that group, I think 3 out of, or at least 2 out of 8 people were lawyers. And so there's a scholar there at Stanford who I didn't know but became very friendly with, named Tom Gray, emeritus for many years now, who wrote wonderful things about Holmes. And Hank, who was running the neuroscience and law program, could see that my interest was in Holmes and trying to understand Holmes and putting Holmes in the larger context of the pragmatist. The other reason why I went out there was, and thinking about the law, I'm married to a lawyer. My wife is a lawyer. When I went to graduate school in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania in 1978, I don't remember the exact number, but several dropped out of the program. They became lawyers and judges. And so the law has kind of been on my mind for a long time. Holmes was an excuse to engage it. Neuroscience was a vehicle, how I got over there. And that's how the book initially emerged.
Jay, could you just describe what you mean by pragmatism? We have a rather wide audience and some people may not be familiar with it.
And, pragmatism does not mean one thing. The pragmatism that I'm talking about goes back to Charles Sanders Peirce, who was an experimentalist. He was in the National Academy of Sciences. Peirce set the first lab up in America at Hopkins. It was a lab devoted to psychophysics with a lot of rigor, but also associated with William James, who was not an experimentalist, was not a scientist, was much more of an artist, but had a wonderful sense of the human condition. And then later, John Dewey, particularly John Dewey, for capturing what counts for the human condition. Pragmatism sees science as just continuous with knowledge acquisition in a very broad sense, and trying to integrate that with ongoing activities, including the law.
So I had a question. I think that you're pointing out in your exploration of sort of the historical moment where experimental psychology got going and the pragmatists were sort of thinking at a philosophical level about how to gain human knowledge. All of that is sort of happening around the same time in the US anyway. And there's an overlapping set of people who are interested in those questions. I wonder, do you think that the actual discoveries of neuroscience cohere with pragmatism, or are you mostly just pointing out that the two lines of inquiry got started historically at around the same time?
I think they just got started at roughly the same time. If I could say a few things, what interested, picking out Holmes in particular, what Holmes was interested was not neuroscience. Of course, his father was a doctor, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Holmes Jr. was first a poet and then a survivor of the war, and then embraced, the law with gusto after the Civil War, and he saw he could do it. And then he was part of the Metaphysical Club with William James and others. But what Holmes really was interested was in the new behavioral sciences, and his really wanted to capture and embrace statistical inference. Yet at the same time that this was going on was sort of the beginning of the statistics and statistical inference and the idea of control groups and the origins of behavioral design rigor. Holmes was very, very interested in being able to use or harness the sort of beginnings of the behavioral sciences to predict behavior, to predict, as he put it, what judges might do, to predict what others would do. But it was the idea of harnessing the behavioral sciences and its sort of scope for rigor, and seeing that might be an opportunity to be integrated in the law. The law is just another part of human inquiry, and statistical inference and behavioral design, he thought, would be an important element in the law. He was in neuroscience, if there were insights in neuroscience, or if there were insights in biology, or if there are insights in other parts of it. But Holmes was really keyed on this behavioral science side and the idea of statistical inference, of being able to predict what might occur.
Right. And it certainly shows up in his jurisprudence too, and his idea that really what law is a way of controlling human behavior. He wasn't so interested in law as embodying sort of the moral wisdom of a culture or that sort of way of thinking about law. It was more about law as a means of controlling the bad man, right?
Be able to predict the bad man. And he thought, that the law expresses the culture in which we live, so it embodies the history and the philosophical presuppositions. But he definitely wanted to harness whatever control you could get by predictive capability.
Yeah. So you have a lot of this notion of controlling behavior. I guess what I'm getting at here is that where do we draw the boundaries in neuroscience, and how much is there an overlap between neuroscience and the law? So, for example, maybe you don't draw boundaries at neuroscience, but there are social neuroscience, there's infant studies, social psychology studies, behavioral economic studies. And you mentioned that Holmes himself was interested in predicting behavior. Is all this neuroscience?
No, neuroscience is one field amongst others. There's neuroscientific chauvinism. When I was a graduate student at Penn, I always remember this, and Eric Kandel came to our group, and my professor was Elliot Steller. And Professor Kandel told us, we're going to lay out for you here the signature of learning. We're going to do so by monitoring, calcium changes in the aplesia neurons. I raised my hand as a graduate student, and I said, Professor Kandel, what makes you think all learning is the same anyway? And what makes you think the neuroscience that comes from those calcium changes is going to be that insightful? Well, I can tell you that first year graduate student Jay Schulkin was pretty much shot down by Kandel because they were so self-certain that neuroscience was going to be able to replace that. I love neuroscience, but what I don't like, and I didn't like in 1978, nor in 2022, is scientism. And that's when you exaggerate what you think you're about before you're there, and you oversell it.
So that's interesting. I don't know if all the listeners would know, but Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize for his work. But my opinion was that he never really was able to understand the basis of associative learning or find the neurons, but he learned a lot about how the nervous system works. And I think that's why he got the Nobel Prize.
And definitely. And that's a good thing in and of itself. And you don't have to oversell the other part. Neuroscience is just one discipline amongst others in the context of trying to understand the human condition, the animal condition.
So one of the things I noticed about your book was you do sort of portray neuroscience and law as often very consistent. But I'm wondering a little bit about the inconsistencies. And I think of
Definitely.
Yeah. So, for example, the notion of moral responsibility. And I know Robert Sapolsky right now is working on a book to try to refute law and its notions of moral responsibility, which comes from a chapter in a book he wrote a little while ago that was very interesting to me. So what about the ways in which law is sort of a cultural practice and neuroscience, and you say neuroscience is also a cultural practice, but aren't they sort of really kind of different in what they're trying to do?
Well, yeah, they are different. I mean, they're not the same. I think for Robert Sapolsky, who is a determinist, basically in his orientation to human behavior, the law and neuroscience might mean something else. But for me, there are all kinds of moments where they're not compatible. Part of being a living investigator, as opposed to being a frozen investigator, is embracing the various kinds of incompatibilities or incommensurabilities that one has to live with. Law and neuroscience is just an instance of that amongst many others. So I see all kinds of places where they're inconsistent. Don't force consistency where there is very little. But if you can, forage for some kind of coherence. Neuroscientific tools will develop and they'll evolve, and they're going to get better and better over time. The issue is how they get integrated, how they get used or misused. And that's something we all need to pay attention to.
So, Jay, one of the things that I think really distinguishes law and neuroscience is our basic conceptualization of human behavior. So, for example, many neuroscientists would say they would treat the brain as a machine. And so when you see maladaptive behavior, it's the machine is breaking down. And so what you do is you fix the machine or try to figure out how to prevent it from breaking down or those kinds of things. Quite often, right, it seems to me the legal system is based on the idea of personal responsibility. I believe there's a bit of, maybe you'll call it agency, could be free will. I think I know the answer. How do we get those things to jive together or work together?
I think you have to sit with uncomfortability there. If you look at sets of neurons, you're often looking at what you think is a machine. It's not the machine. So one issue when people throw out the idea of a machine, it's certainly not the machine that Leibniz had in mind, the great 17th century German thinker who talked about computational systems as machinery, animal machinery, where you could predict everything necessarily. The issue, and this is again what Holmes' good insight was, it's statistical inference, not necessary inference. So that machines, particularly biological machines, are not as predictable as other kinds of machines. So we have to change our notion of machinery. It's much more biological, much more labile, has more plasticity in it. And that's a critical feature for us. Look, when it comes to holding people accountable and keeping them responsible, which is part of what the law is about, that's just how we do things and how I think we ought to do things. And there's a moral imperative there. Does it map out isomorphically with neuroscience? No. Neuroscience comes in here as a tool, as an aid, if it can, for describing the condition of people under certain kinds of conditions. Just like whether you live, if you have access to food or you're living in poverty or you have poor schools. It's another sort of fact-based or attempted fact-based considerations when thinking about the human condition.
I just want to point out, I really love that way of thinking about things. That's very helpful to me in my own thought process.
So I'll throw this in there, and that is, so you mentioned that the brain is a machine that doesn't work like other machines. It doesn't look like it does. Of course, other machines we built and we engineered. And obviously the brain has been engineered in a different way, evolutionarily. And it's also a really complex machine. I think part of the issue is what is our strategy? So I don't know if I would give up yet on the notion that the brain is a machine, simply because it's a complex machine that we don't understand. And as you know, these arguments, I'm sure, it's a very complex machine we don't understand. And as we understand more of it, our ability to predict will become much better. Should that even be a goal?
Yeah, I think that, well, two things. One, the greater the predictive capability, in part, there's more epistemic coherence. But I do think we have to re-envision what the notion of machine is in biological systems. I agree with what you said. We know a lot more in the things we build ourselves. Those are our instruments. And we live in an age when, or any age in science, at least for the last 500 years, it's a sort of fluidity between the things we build, the instruments that we generate for seeing, and the stuff that we study. That is, in this case, biology and the neuroscience. It's such a porous relationship between nature and culture in that regard that it's hard to separate out. But one thing's for sure, that the 17th century notion of a machine, the clock view of it by necessity, that had to change once we started to consider biological systems. And once the idea of statistical inference and probability, not necessity, became a more dominant conception of how to understand the world.
The other analogy I think of is the social sciences and the social organism. A society or a culture, which also is, of course, human-made, but it's not very controllable and it's not very predictable. But we can still, and this goes to John Dewey and his wonderful work on the social sciences, we can still learn a lot, even though we can't necessarily predict with certainty what factors will lead to what results.
Yeah. One of John Dewey's great books, was The Quest for Certainty, or being able to live in uncertainty. That's also hard for people.
Well, that's wonderful. That sounds like the topic for your next book.
So one of the things is, Susan, and I think this was why I enjoy this podcast so much, is, Susan and I come from different backgrounds in terms of these very questions, and you're kind of right in the middle of it. That's why I really like to have you on this podcast. But one of the things I was going to ask, so statistics doesn't necessarily mean that there are things that are just probabilistic. It seems to me that we use statistics because there's variables that we don't understand. And so we're trying to make the best prediction we can. And if we were working on something in a test tube, a lot of chemists don't need to use statistics because they have very little variability in what they're studying. If you're studying human or animal behavior, there's a tremendous amount of variability. So again, it's a strategy. I certainly can't say I'm right or wrong, but this is the kind of strategy that I would employ.
Yeah, and one strategy doesn't fit all, depending on what the context is. So much of, it's contextual. What's the thing you're trying to study? What are you trying to make sense of? What you can say, bringing it back to, in my lifetime, our lifetime, the growth of neuroscience over 50 years is incredible in terms of cutting across all the disciplines, from the law to physics. That's pretty exciting. We're still left, parenthetically mentioned here, that you don't have a lot of cures yet from neuroscience, despite the growth of knowledge on the cure side.
So, Jay, though, there have been startling developments in terms of people who couldn't see can now see. There are people that couldn't express themselves. Now there's actually ways where it's not just the muscle movements that are being recorded and translated into speech, but the thoughts are being translated into speech. I mean, I would say that there have been a number of important breakthroughs. Major things. We haven't solved Alzheimer's or obesity or those major problems. It's true, but we have made a number of breakthroughs.
No question, Terry. No question. But, I remember many years ago when I interested in autism, and a family came up to me, and said, we're the cures. There are not a lot of cures for a lot of the things that plague people, but there are cures about vision. There's no question. Audition. And inch by inch, we're going to get closer and closer. It's just not fast enough for people. That's all I meant by that.
Yeah. Alzheimer's is an example of that, where it's a terrible disease afflicting many people. And as you know, we've not been able to advance our knowledge on that. And we may have been barking up the wrong tree for 100 years. So, yeah. I certainly understand what you're saying there.
Can I pick up on another place where your comment about how neuroscience is really spanning so much territory these days? And this is something, I'm a spanner. I like spanning. So I'm excited about that. But I have learned, and partly from my wonderful conversations with Terry, that maybe it's important to also be a little bit skeptical about premature spanning. And to what extent do you think we need to sort of slow down, especially around sort of complex social behavior? Because you do quite a bit of spanning in your book as well. And so I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are about that.
It's good to have Terry to remind us, don't go too far. Don't wander too far in your youthful enthusiasm. A lot of us love that youthful enthusiasm. We're still living on it and hope to die that way. But you want to be reminded, what do you really have here? Because you need enthusiasm to keep inquiry going. So the spanning part and the excitement part. But you want to be reminded, where does it have traction and where is just hand waving? Hand waving is an element, and you want to know the difference. I think that's all that is, really. And it's a continuous sort of attention to that. And then you want to look, where is it really getting more traction than others, than in other places?
Jay, one of the things that I've noticed is the press will take about any finding, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I wonder what university public relations folks, media folks have to do with that, because their job is to promote the university. And sometimes there's a finding there that it may be premature, but it's a press release comes out and it's picked up. And then by the time it's picked up and modified, and typically gets more and more sensational as it goes through these modifications. And what we end up with is ultimately we can lose some confidence in science, and not just neuroscience, but science.
Well, particularly in our country, issues of science and its legitimacy, get called into question a lot. The same human beings that are in sciences in every other part of life. Lots of mistakes, lots of overselling, fabrication. The same human condition. That's why it's a sociological thing. The press, of course, yeah. I mean, from a university point of view, they want a big finding occurred here. From the press point of view, they're hungry. All right, being rightfully so, to sort of show that, tell that, and then how much of it's true? Well, that over time. How much time do people have? What's their attention span? Well, not very long. What they first hear, and then it could probably either dissipates over time. That's not much going to change. I think the age we're living in now across the globe is sort of the transparent active manipulation of information where you're not. And that done on a kind of a broad-based, in some ways, there's nothing new about that. But in some ways, it is new now because like everything else about us, our tools are better for doing it.
Right. There's a science associated with it now that comes out of marketing and all of that. Yeah. And so it's both good, but it's also so dangerous because put in the wrong hands.
And that's the thing about science. It could be used for good or bad.
You kind of addressed that in the book or mentioned it anyway. And that is, you talked about the rush to look scientific. And so you say the rush to look scientific, basically you said that we sometimes talk about quantities separate from their qualitative components. So fact versus value. And I also think that might be another place where there needs to be a gap bridged between law and science. Quantification, right, is a rush towards precision. First off, would Holmes agree with this? And I think there's a difference, right, between certainly the law is interested in fact, but there seems to be more of a value component. Do you think we should have more of a value component in neuroscience as well? Or should we just get them information and let whoever is going to, the policymakers use it in the way that they're going to use it or misuse it?
Well, for me, and I think this is true of Holmes, it depends on what valuation is a property of what we do across the board. We evaluate, we value, we place value. What's the value of X, Y, and Z? So valuation is a primordial part of the way we see and understand the world we're in, whether it's science or any other part of our life. And it doesn't just mean one thing. Like here's a set of values and here's a set of facts. A lot of the facts that we find are embedded in the valuation scheme that underlies our orientation to events.
So I certainly agree with that. But don't you think that particularly early in scientific training, the idea is don't let those kinds of personal things, right? So no matter what your belief is, the data will be the final decider, right? And in that sense, it is fact over value. But I certainly do agree that it's hard to get around that, but that's the goal, right?
The goal is to be faithful to the phenomena that you think you're studying. The goal is to what am I trying to understand here? What tools am I using to understand? What does it mean to understand something here? And that varies depending on what you're actually trying to study. One rule doesn't fit all, but certainly valuation. That was a big thing for John Dewey.
I was just about to say that. We're talking like Dewey again. Yes.
We're talking like Dewey again. You're talking to somebody who's very influenced by John Dewey. And, Holmes looked at John Dewey. Holmes was a beautiful writer. He's a poet. He was a class poet. Dewey's the opposite. He's a Vermont. I have colleagues, I've tried to get to read Dewey and they looked at me and they said, you're kidding. Gave up in milliseconds. And Holmes thought of him. I don't know what he's saying, but because I can't stand his writing, but I think I agree with him.
So you have some good quotes in your book. Yeah, very good quotes about that in your book.
What Dewey was profound about, and human all too human, they're all limited, including J. Schulkin, the naturalization. So it's not foreign. So it wouldn't be foreign for, like we're doing right here, that somebody from the law school, right, and somebody from the behavioral neurosciences would have a common context for a conversation about the human condition and its inconsistencies in our attempt to try to forage for some kind of coherence. It's a very much a Dewey conception orientation for how he's, so yeah, I'm very much in the tradition of John Dewey, for sure.
Well, I can certainly hear that. As a fan of John Dewey myself, I can hear it all over the way you think about things. There's so much we want to explore with you and limited time. So I want to sort of switch topics a little bit, if that's okay with Terry.
Yeah, that's fine.
You were talking about how in some areas we're getting more traction around, using neuroscience to sort of understand complex social problems and others not. I'm wondering what areas do you think we really are getting traction as opposed to just sort of being on similar paths, but not really?
I think plasticity of neural function. I mean, something my old colleague Bruce McEwen emphasized so much, for which the hippocampus plays a big role. That's for Terry.
That's the amygdala.
It's good you threw that in.
I had to get that in there.
Yeah,
but
thank
plasticity. You're welcome, sir. The way by which the brain changes, not by which the way as an important element for what we're exposed to early on, depending on where we live, what we're exposed to, the trauma that we've undergone or not undergone, the cumulative properties from our families or our communities or lack of them. We know a lot more about the neuroscience of development. And it's not just in development, it's lifelong. Lifelong plasticity, lifelong epigenetics. There's good insights about the brain that I think are important and useful for understanding the human condition.
Absolutely. And really being used in anti-discrimination law, for example, to explain. Yeah, so important.
And it's just one piece amongst, and I think not to reduce it to that, but to see it as one piece amongst others in understanding the phenomenon.
So I have a question about that. So those things that you talked about, they've been derived from studies that are pretty much, especially the plasticity stuff, they've been derived from empirical laboratory studies about how the brain and the nervous system works and changes. That I understand is and this is kind of a hardcore position, but that's kind of hardcore neuroscience. The question is extending that to things like morality or extending that to things like greed or discrimination. Isn't that a big leap?
Yeah, from that kind of thing. I think it's less of a leap, when you look at brain activation to unfamiliar people. One of the things I learned from Jerome Kagan, and I interacted a lot with him, and earlier than that, Paul Rosen Penn, was the fundamental distinction between familiar and unfamiliar events and how we're just oriented as a kind of way to group what's familiar and what's less familiar. And so some issues, and certainly Darwin noted this as well, is, the familiar really stands out. Community solidification, our moral notions, are often just based on what's familiar to us. The neuroscience side is basically showing or trying to show, and there are discrepancies in that data, is you're more likely to make one judgment towards X, Y, and Z if it's familiar to you than you are if it's unfamiliar to you, that is a person or a group. You're more likely to judge it one way if it's familiar to you, where you have access to it, where it's part of your experience. I think back, I grew up in the Bronx, right by Yankee Stadium. I was born in 1952. I heard so many languages from so many different parts of the world. I think back, it exposed me to lots of different kinds of people and their stories. So the unfamiliar was becoming more and more familiar. A lot of our moral notions come out of the communities that we're in. Neuroscience is not going to lay out morality. Our understanding of morality is going to utilize some of the neuroscientific findings, our predispositions, our vulnerabilities, our rapid responses to some things. We're still going to need folks from the law and from philosophy, to lay out treatises for what's a moral life, what's a good life look like, how do moral notions permeate the human condition, whether we're honest about it or less honest about it. I want to say, one other thing on the neuroscience side, there's a peptide called oxytocin that gets a lot of press and should. The same hormone that's tied to parturition, tied to social attachment, tied to social growth, is also tied to social solidification. But it's not the hormone of love. As my old colleague Bruce McEwen used to say, it's not that, because oxytocin works. If you're in my group, that's one thing. If you're outside my group, I'm going to be aggressive.
So, Jay, that was probably the most thoughtful answer to this particular issue that I've heard. So thanks for that.
Let me pick up on something there that I noticed is both an issue with John Dewey and also in your book got me thinking about this, which is you really emphasize the connections between the human sort of social bent and the desire to get along and to do well and do good in a social environment and morality. But there is a whole nother literature about the way that morality arises out of an individual being able to say no to the norms of a social group. And I think, for example, of the Milgram experiment and the 1/3 of participants who refused to give the shocks when the supposed doctor ordered people to shock others as part of an experiment. And 1/3 of those participants said, I won't do it. And the other 2/3 went ahead and did it. And so I'm wondering how that sort of fits into your ideas about the connections between neuroscience and morality.
Thank goodness there's enough of us to say no. I mean, civil disobedience, non-trivial thing, from Thoreau to Martin Luther King, to any of us under conditions where we think, wait a minute, I don't want to be doing this. It's just not an easy thing and you can't take it for granted. And there's not enough of it. To resist the community, absolutely. In this very fractured world that we're living in right now to the nth degree, I'm always trying to find where might we overlap? Is there any overlap in our universes such that we can have a conversation where we can point out what's common? I'm always looking for that. That's my approach, trying to find some silver linings, even though it's so damn muted at the moment. So much not that. So, yeah, to be disobedient, to say no. I forget John Lewis's phrase, go out and cause a little trouble. But you can't count on it. It's rare, and it's easily abused. Nothing is given here. When Barack Obama and many others talk about the arc of history, I don't believe in that. You have to fight out each generation. It can go lots of different ways. And that's something Holmes, Oliver Wendell Jones Jr., despite his imperfections, and he had a lot of them, understood really well. And I think he learned that during that great war that he fought in and got shot 3 times.
But I am wondering if the way in which we understand that morality sometimes requires bucking the norms of a social group, whether that doesn't sort of contradict the notion that morality rises out of these sort of social bonding kinds of phenomenon that neuroscience has identified.
Yeah, morality is not reduced to that social bonding. Morality is much more than that. The neuroscience side of it, or the sociological side of it, just shows how important it is to our survival, that group formation, not the principles, the fundamental moral principles.
Jay, I have a question, and it has to do with the mind. And you wrote in your book, an experimentalist is often dirty and murky, and the life of the mind is often not clear in the realm of the experimentalist. I think you could have substituted my name for experimentalist in that. And so my question is, the mind is a very abstract concept, and I'm no expert on philosophy, but it does seem like philosophers like to argue about it. From the perspective of a neuroscientist, what use is that concept?
The mind? Oh, gosh. As long as it's not one thing, that's for sure. And it's easily abused. Terry, if you want to eliminate it, there have been many traditions, had tried in one way or another to stop using that term. I'm a pragmatist about terms and not an ideologue about it. I just can't see how we would go about sort of explaining or using very common sense ways of understanding each other. Terry has beliefs and desires. That's part of what you mean by a mind. Computational design, well, it's part of what you might mean by mind. Avoidance, that it sort of comes up in so many different aspects of the condition. Now, I can tell you, Holmes is closer to you, Terry. That is, he says, I don't even want to use a lot of these terms if they're not going to allow me to be predictive. And most of them are obscure. So you're going to find a colleague there who is very much anti-use of a term like that.
I was just going to say, that these terms often, certainly in psychology, we have a lot of constructs, and these are ideas that are constructed to try to explain things. So we talk about beliefs and desires. A lot of people would say, well, really, they're measured with respect to various kinds of behaviors. And it might be a pen and pencil test, or it might be, someone choosing a particular product. But they're just, they're made up, right? They don't have a real existence.
They're tools.
Yeah.
And that's it. Listen, lots of things are made up. We live in communities where we construct things. What are we? Right? We build things. We construct things. And terms get eliminated over time. That Richard Rorty, a pragmatist, what was then called neo-pragmatism, is, we eliminate terms over time. Some terms are useful, some terms aren't. Most of us don't talk about witches anymore. Most of us don't talk about a lot of things anymore that we once did. And that's part of, the adventure of our epistemic quests. Which terms hold up and which terms don't. That's certainly how I see it.
Along the lines of terms, I had one that I really was curious what you meant, which is the neural basis for agency. What are you referring to there?
Well, sort of a primary way, and it may not be across all cultures. Now, this is partly a cultural issue. Certainly Western culture, the notion of agency, is a primary thing. That's an agent there. I'm going to hold that person responsible. That's one of the ways that it gets used. Agency is kids early on, look to see, is someone an agent or not? The developmental literature has sort of been all over that for many, many years. Agency is in our lexicon, rightly or wrongly to the degree that it is. In fact, one of the issues about agency, I can't remember the group that talks about it in terms of it, is just learning how to limit its use. It's so easily used that we start associating it with objects that we wouldn't normally do. So part of the issue here, and this is philosophic and scientific and it's porous, is when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate, and what are your reasons for either one? There's no question agency is a huge category for us in the West, less so in other cultures. It's not a given that it's automatic, the sense of agency that we have in the West.
But is it something neuroscientists are trying to study?
Yeah. What's it mean to study it here? It's not like you're going to find a piece of the brain, I don't think. I could be wrong. There's a piece for the neuroscience of agency. It's right over there. But that's true of many others. I mean, agency is just one concept amongst others for which, if I look in the brain, it's not like I'm just going to see it there. Neuroscience here comes in as a tool. Well, when kids are making sense of the world, what's the brain look like when they're thinking about agency? And what's the distributed network in the brain that's associated with it? Now, the fantasy is you can take that distributed network and you'd say, well, that's the neuroscience of agency. That I would be skeptical of, and I am skeptical of where we are now. Where we are 100 years from now, that's a different story.
So I know we could go on a long time, but I appreciate very much you joining us today, Jay. I thought it was a very stimulating conversation. And I know you're heading off to Cambridge. I wish you well. Hope you don't lose too much weight on that British food. So anyway.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. And do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.